In this video, we'll be talking about the two basic approaches you can take when world building, the macro approach and the micro approach. These approaches can help you create a world for just about anything, writing stories, tabletop gaming, and what we are most concerned with, live action role-playing games. I'll also be taking you through my personal approach to world building, and we'll have a discussion on how you can take these two approaches and create your own method of world building. In a later video, I'll be discussing the fundamentals of quest building, but for now, we'll focus on how you create the world your players will be adventuring in. If you'd like to see more LARP-centric content, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. You can also support me via Patreon, link in the description below. Now, on to the video. To help explain the two basic approaches, I'd like to use the story of the town of Vanderville. We'll show how you'd create a world for Vanderville, a city you could use as a backdrop for a story or maybe even a LARP quest. Vanderville is a city in the country of Osman. 50 years ago, there was a civil war in Osman, and Vanderville was on the losing side. The civil wars primarily fought for theological reasons, but in Vanderville, they were more concerned with security. They needed forces to stop bandits from attacking their trade routes. The capital city refused, so they joined the rebellion theological army, because they promised them security. The citizens converted to the rebel faction's religion, but without any true conviction. When the war came to their town, the protection promised them by the rebels never came. The town was swiftly conquered and their farms were burned. Eventually the rebellion theological faction lost. The people of Vanderville had to rebuild and they received no help from the government. In fact, they were treated with scorn. The people of Vanderville converted back to their previous religion to satisfy the government, but they were now seen as faithless by the majority of the country. Vanderville still holds a grudge against the other people of Osman, specifically the government, because of how they have been treated since the war ended. With the macro approach, you would take a larger view of the world. You would start by creating a larger framework to situate Vanderville in. For example, you might start by determining the history of the world, or the different cultures, or possibly the various nation-states. Once you have these larger details outlined, you work on the smaller details. With our example of Vanderville, before you wrote the description and history of the town, you would create the world where the town was situated. You would create the religion, their beliefs and practices, why there is even a theological split to begin with. You would be able to trace the beginnings of the conflict back to its roots, and all of this before you would start writing the town's own story. This approach requires a lot of work to be done before you even begin writing the story of Vanderville. In fact, you might end up writing several stories to fill in the details before you even get to the story you originally wanted to tell. That was something I personally encountered when taking the macro approach. The last time I tried the macro approach, I wrote a backstory for a side character of a novel I wanted to write. And what was to be a few page synopsis turned into a full-blown novel idea. The upside is that you will have a lush and vibrant world ready for your players to explore. When you begin to write your story or quest, you will spend a lot more time focusing on story elements because you will already have the background details figured out. A prime example of this is Tolkien. He took this approach, creating an engaging world a long time before writing The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. Silmarillion wasn't even intended to be released as a book. That was just background material for the world he created for his stories. With the micro approach, you start with a small detail and work your way outward, creating the context as you go. Using our example above, you might want to start your players in a town that had a grudge against the government of Osman. Then you may want to figure out what that grudge was. In this case, it was because the government wasn't helping them rebuild after a civil war. You may then decide that they were on the losing side of the civil war. Why did they rebel? They rebelled because Osman wasn't doing anything to protect them from bandits. They turned to the rebellion faction who offered them protection. This approach is a lot more disorganized. You come up with the information about your world as you explore how your players will encounter it. It often lends itself well to those people who like to freewrite. That being said, there will be times you'll find you'll have to stop writing your quest and work on world details. Also, if you're not careful and you don't keep organized notes, you might come to a point where you are reinventing details you created elsewhere. And worse, you could be contradicting yourself without realizing it. On the plus side, the micro approach lets you jump right into creating your quest story. You don't have to spend countless hours creating details that you may not use. You can just focus on the elements that will matter in the story that you're telling. Now a little bit how I use the micro and the macro approaches. I've tried both approaches, they both work, and in truth, they often overlap, and most people will use them in some combination. However, one approach will usually be more dominant than the other. Conceptually, I like the macro approach. The idea of getting all the larger pieces of a world in place before working on individual details has its appeal. It can be important to have a fleshed out world for players to adventure in. There is history behind every conflict. As I mentioned, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings is a good example of this. Tolkien spent countless hours creating the world before he wrote the books we now love. In fact, that's the same approach I used to use every time I wanted to write a story, but it never ended very well. More often than not, I would get stuck on an aspect of the world and found myself unable to move beyond that roadblock. It just didn't fit with my natural workflow, no matter how much I tried to force it. Once I moved past the idea that I needed to know everything about my world before I could work within it, I became much more productive. My exact approach changes depending on what kind of project I'm working on. When working on my approach for my LARP event, The Shattered Kingdoms, I mostly take a micro approach. I didn't start with a fully realized world. I used two basic things to build up the world: the storylines, of course, and the background for the relics. Each relic has a unique background, adding either historical events, gods, or legendary figures. Throughout the years, I drew upon the few details of the relics, or from the storylines from the previous years, to build future world details. The longer the event continues, the more filled out the world becomes. For this project, I kept a website on World Anvil to keep the different details organized. In this way, I don't forget or contradict them. You can find a link to this page in the description below if you'd like to see an example of taking the micro approach. When it comes to creating a campaign setting for a tabletop game, I have to approach it differently. Mainly because I come up with setting ideas before adventure ideas. I write out my concept and create a good framework for important details. The main things I typically work on are creating a general world history, writing a bit about the major races, how magic works, and any other unique quirks that are important to set the world apart from other worlds. I then switch from the macro approach to the micro approach. I create a story for the adventurers to play through. Along the way, I fill in more detailed information. For example, individual cities. I might take a break to work on a cultural tension and other world aspects the characters might encounter on their journeys in that area. When it comes to writing stories, I approach it with a heavy emphasis on the micro approach. I'll focus on a story element or a character concept and then create a world around them. When I tried the macro approach, I often never finished a project. I found I would work on a detail and then decide that specific element needed its own story, and it just continued on and on and on. I'd start writing the story, filling in the details, and then find another aspect of the story that needed its own story. While not necessarily a bad thing, more ideas aren't bad. The problem was it caused me to get bogged down in a quagmire of content that never got satisfactorily finished. Now to talk a little bit about your approach. Everyone will approach world building differently. Like myself, you might also approach different kinds of projects with different kinds of approaches. The main goal is to optimize your workflow. For some, that might be taking the macro approach and filling out a world's worth of details, so when you get to writing the story or the quest, you will have all the information you need to have your characters or players interact with the world. Maybe your workflow is more erratic and the micro approach appeals to you. While it will allow you to dig right in and write a quest from the start, you will find you'll likely have to stop several times to answer some bigger questions about your world. If you're smart, you'll write down notes about the world as you create them. The chances are you'll combine the two methods, using what workflow works best for you. There is a certain amount of trial and error. Take the time to try both approaches, maybe even on the same project, to see which one helps you make progress you can feel more satisfied with. If you put in enough practice, keeping those two approaches in mind, you will eventually find the right balance. Now that you heard a little bit about the micro and the macro approach, I'd really like to hear about your thoughts on the approaches. Do you use any of them when you're writing your worlds? Comment in the section below. And thank you. Keep on LARPing.